aspects of Jewish literature, partly to see the larger pond, as it were, into which the biblical stream ran, but also to recognise a lot of the books we're talking about, particularly the books from the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, the Old Testament apocryphal books, are of course part of that larger set. So when I need it, I think I'll have access to the internet. I can't be sure about the rest of you, but it's every man for himself when it comes to internet access.
Or you could share your number for your internet.
I could, couldn't I? I think I've already used up the monthly quota. I think if I'm reading it correct, it's just running a bit slow, but my slow is still faster than this library. Okay, so let's look at some of the Jewish writings from the Second Temple period, because in one sense, the entire Old Testament is an example of Jewish writings from the Second Temple period. Okay? Sure, some of the traditions in the Old Testament not only talk about events from the First Temple and earlier, but may even have been created as documents, but they were not biblical documents. It wasn't Bible at that stage. Okay, so even something like, say, Deuteronomy or Samuel or Judges or whatever, yes, I'm sure many of those books existed prior to the exile, but they were not sacred texts. They were not biblical texts in the way that we so the concept of Bible or scripture or whatever, the law and the prophets, that's a Second Temple construct, even if some of the documents had their origins before the exile. And of course, equally, depending where you date the New Testament, and quite how you date the Second Temple period, all of the New Testament actually is also Jewish writings from the Second Temple period. I mean, who wrote the New Testament that wasn't Jewish? Possibly Luke.
Yeah, wasn't he Greek?
Well, because we don't know. But if we think the author of the anonymous text, which we call Luke Acts, was a non-Jew, but if he was a non-Jew, he was awfully well versed in the Greek Old Testament. So, and that's not impossible. Like Rick Strellan from UQ thinks he was a Jewish priest and not a Gentile. So who knows? Okay, so let's clarify what I mean by Second Temple, and that will also illustrate what I was just saying. Effectively, we're talking about the period from the end of the exile, into the Babylonian exile, through to the fall of Jerusalem in 70. Okay, so that's when the Romans actually captured Jerusalem and actually accidentally set fire to the temple. They were actually under strict orders not to damage the temple, because it was one of the most fantastic. Bear in mind that the political dynamics around the Jewish revolt are not simply Jews versus Romans. So there was actually a Jewish army led by King Agrippa II fighting on the side of the Roman Empire, trying to regain his capital, Jerusalem. They did not want the capital destroyed. They did not want the temple destroyed. But some of the soldiers, in that sort of adrenaline rush after they'd finally captured the city, and were in that bloodlust and need to see a therapist real fast, set fire to the, sort of threw a firebrand or whatever into the temple precinct, and it caught fire. But that was not the intention of the army. They didn't intend to destroy Jerusalem. They just wanted it back. Okay. So normally when we say Second Temple period, we mean basically from the time of the first people coming back from the Babylonian exile down to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. You could equally argue that really the Second Temple period doesn't finish until the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132-135, because that's kind of the last hurrah of the Zealots. So in effect, the war that started in 66 didn't really finish, wasn't all over Red Rover, till 135. Okay, and by 135, Jerusalem is no longer a Jewish city. It's a pagan city, and the province is called Palestina, not Judea. So, the Romans have decided, that's it, guys. No more Jewish presence in this part of the empire. So it becomes thoroughly paganized. So, hence my comment before, if you go to 135 as the Second Temple period, then the New Testament is also basically finished by then as well. So actually, Old and New Testament is a Second Temple project. Okay? In a way that the Mishnah is not. The Mishnah is 200, but it's the reconstruction of Jewish life without a temple. So it's not Second Temple. Again, many of the contents in the Mishnah come from the Second Temple period, just like many of the contents in the Second Temple literature come from the First Temple period. So anyway, so we're basically talking about the period from when the returnees are allowed to return from Babylon, and we don't know how many of them and how big, we don't know the real circumstances, down to the collapse and the destruction of that project with the siege of Jerusalem. So putting numbers on that, the Persian period, 539 to 322 BCE, so that's basically 200 years the Persian Empire lasted. Alexander the Great gets about 10 years, but in that time he destroys everything, ruins all the furniture and rearranges the shop. He's followed, of course, by all of his successors, but in terms of Palestinian Jewish history, the initially significant group are the Ptolemies, who'd had control of Egypt, Palestine, and I think some of the Aegean area. And that's because in ancient times, not just in Hellenistic times, but right through antiquity, the normal natural limit of Egyptian influence was the north of northern Galilee, basically the Lebanese mountains. Okay? Because that was their natural sphere of projecting their influence, collecting taxes, keeping a strategic buffer to their northeast. And empires that were based in Mesopotamia or Anatolia, Turkey, they normally extended their influence to the Lebanese mountains. And if they were on a roll, they would push towards Egypt. And if the Egyptians were in a roll, they'd push beyond the Lebanese mountains. So the Lebanese mountains are a natural, like the Swiss Alps. I mean, it's a natural kind of divider within the geography of the area. And so during the British Mandate period in Palestine, for instance, in those days the agreed border between the French area, Lebanon, and the British area, Palestine, was north of it was basically the Lebanese mountains. And it was just actually south of the Lebanese mountains. So the Lebanese mountains and the villages to their south were part of Lebanon. And there were a group of what are called the 7 villages, which were Lebanese villages. And somewhere in the British Mandate period, I can't remember the exact date, these 7 villages were transferred from Lebanon to Palestine. In other words, the border was shifted because the British Mandate had a policy of making sure that the future Jewish state would control the headwaters of the Jordan River. So these 7 villages found themselves Palestine and then found themselves Israel. And it's been a difficult transition for them. And on a bad day, Lebanon wants them back, but they're not going to get them, of course. So the border between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids is exactly that patch of land, okay? So initially, Palestine naturally comes under the control of the Egyptian kingdom, run by Ptolemy and his successors, and Ptolemy was a Greek. Okay? And the Seleucids, who are basically Mesopotamia, Syria and Turkey, they obviously followed directly on from Alexander, but in 198 there was a battle at Panias, or Banias in Hebrew, in Arabic. Okay, so Panias as in the god Pan, and Banias with a B in Arabic, because Arabic doesn't have P. And indeed in 3 weeks and 1 day some of you will be standing at Banias. Okay, so the Battle of Banias, or Panias, led to the Egyptian kingdom losing its control of Palestine and retreating south of Gaza, and the Seleucid kingdom extending its control further south, which means basically 200 BCE is when the Jewish kingdom, or the Jewish patch, okay, it wasn't a kingdom at that stage, but the Jewish people living in Palestine, up until 200 BCE, they were ruled from Egypt. After 200, they come under Seleucid control. And this leads directly into the Maccabean revolt 20 years later. Okay? 20, 30 years later. Because the dynamics then, of course, change to the extent that whereas in the past Palestine was the northeast frontier of Egypt and a relatively peaceful frontier, now it's the southwest border of a Syrian empire seeking to expand. So they're now the troublesome province on the bottom left corner, which is exactly the most troublesome frontier in terms of Seleucid contact with Egypt. And the Seleucids would have gone after Egypt, except that Rome sent a delegate, shades of another Rome a bit further to the west. They sent a delegate who drew literally a line in the sand, and said to Antiochus, if you send your forces over this line, you will be at war with Rome. Okay, and Rome at that point was the rising power in the west, and Antiochus backed off, but he was grumpy. Word got back to the Jews that he had been defeated and killed, so they rose in rebellion, but he was not dead, and he was not happy. So the stage was set for an unhappy relationship over the next couple of years. Okay? So from 198 to roughly 130, so basically from 200 to 130, officially and in many ways very real, Jerusalem was under the control of the Seleucid Empire. With the Maccabean rebellion in the 160s, and it's staggered on over a couple of years, you eventually segue into the Hasmonean dynasty, who are what the Maccabeans call themselves when they become kings. Okay, so the Hasmonean dynasty, and as you can see, it lasted about 100 years. And that's followed by a lovely gentleman called Herod. Okay, Herod the Great, who was appointed king of the Jews in 40. Took him 3 years to actually kick all his enemies' heads out of shape and take direct control. So sometimes we say that his rule began in 37, but he was actually given the job title in the year 40, and then he died in the year 4 BCE. Okay, and he was followed by three of his surviving sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, and then eventually they're followed by Agrippa I and Agrippa II. So the Herodian dynasty actually lasts until 96 CE. So it's about 150 years. And the Persian Empire only lasted 200 years. So it's not a bad run. Had a few hiccups along the way, like the Jewish rebellion and so on. Okay. So that's the Second Temple period in a nutshell. Now, apart from declaring war with the world, okay, what were they doing? What sort of literature was coming out of this period? Yeah. So this is where we're getting all the so-called Jewish writings of the Second Temple period. Now, I wanted to start by going back to the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, looking at the prologue to Ben Sira, or Ecclesiasticus. So this is a document, and this is where it messes with your head a little bit. This is a guy called Sirach, Ben Sira, and his grandfather is called Jesus. Okay? Because we had to remember Jesus is a perfectly normal Jewish name, although not so common these days. All right? It's actually Joshua. Okay? But in Greek it was always represented as Jesus. So Hebrew Yehoshua, Aramaic Yeshua, Arabic Issa, and in Greek Yesu, Jesus. So we get this different forms of the same name. So this is what this guy has done. He's writing a few decades later in the 2nd century BCE, but he's translating his grandfather's work. Okay, and he writes a preface to the beginning of his grandfather's document. So this is before chapter 1 of the book of Ben Sira. Okay, many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that followed them. So this is a guy writing around 150, 140 CE. And for these we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. So, interesting. This is because of a piece of wisdom literature. Now those who read the scriptures, those who read the writings, must not only themselves understand them. This is actually a little text for you guys. Okay. Finally, the last session of the semester. Okay. Those who read the scriptures must not only themselves understand them, which is helpful, but must also, as lovers of learning, be able through the spoken and the written word to help the outsiders. So, my grandfather Jesus, I love that phrase, okay, my grandfather Jesus, who had devoted himself especially to the reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our ancestors, and had acquired considerable proficiency in them, was himself also led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom, so that by becoming familiar also with his book, those who love learning might make even greater progress in living according to the law. Okay, and as I said earlier, by the end of the book, wisdom is going to be identified as the incarnation of Torah. Okay, or if you like, Torah is, put it the other way, Torah is the incarnation of divine wisdom. But the two figures have blended. Now there's a bit more to come, but there's an interesting first-person account from middle to the latter part of the 2nd century BCE about how Scripture was functioning in the life of cultivated Jewish people in Jerusalem, and how and even talking about the law, the prophets, and the writings by the people that came after the prophets. So he's aware of that kind of structuring of the tradition, and notice the kind of the acceptance that there's a recognized role for people who are scholars of the sacred text, not only to teach the text but also to generate fresh texts which continue the process of instruction and wisdom, with the goal that by using the secondary literature you'll be better at keeping the Torah. So it's, I find that a fascinating glimpse into the dynamics of sacred scripture in around the middle of the 2nd century. Okay, so as the Maccabean crisis is kind of fizzling out and the Hasmonean dynasty is coming on the scene, or earlier on, my grandfather Jesus would have been around and alive at the time of the Maccabean rebellion. Okay, so through this period there are people generating the kind of material that you get in Ecclesiasticus or Ben Sirach or Sirach. Okay. Then he goes on. There's a paragraph I've cut out where he actually reflects on the difficulty of being a translator. So he's quite a sophisticated person. He says, I hope when you're reading my, bumbling attempts to translate my father's Hebrew into reasonable Greek, my grandfather's Hebrew into reasonable Greek, you will cut me a bit of slack, because it's not always easy to take something that's written in Hebrew and express it in Greek. Okay? And anybody who's worked with biblical languages and so on knows that dynamic very well. So it was familiar even to the grandson of Ben Sirach. And he has a sense of humility about, you want to read the original, but if you don't have Hebrew, here's my best shot at trying to put it into Greek for you. Sorry.
And how do we get this writing, his writing?
It's in the Bible. It's in the Apocrypha of the Old Testament. Ben Sirach is one of the books of the Catholic and the Greek and the Anglican Old Testament. And it's simply the prologue to Ben Sirach. So if you've got an NRSV that has the Apocrypha in it, when you go to Ben Sirach, or the Wisdom of Jesus, or Sirach, Ecclesiasticus has various titles, just at chapter 1, you'll get, before the beginning of chapter 1, you'll get the prologue, and it's this bit here. Okay? So it's a fascinating text. And then, so he talks about how, please excuse my bad Greek, I'm doing my best. Okay? And then he goes on to the 3rd paragraph of his prologue. When I came to Egypt in the 38th year of the reign of Euergetes, and stayed for some time, I found opportunity for no little instruction. That's a quaint way to put it. It seemed highly necessary that I should myself devote some diligence and labour to the translation of this book. During that time I've applied my skill day and night to complete and publish the book for those living abroad who wish to gain learning and are disposed to live according to the law. Okay, so the law is like the Torah, is like the benchmark. Okay, so it's become a classic. It now sets the agenda within the world of Second Temple Judaism. Temple is still there, but the main focus is no longer on the temple. Focus is becoming on the book. And of course, if you're in the diaspora communities outside Palestine, you can't take the temple with you, and you're not allowed to build a second temple. Okay, so you can take the book. It's the ultimate portable religion device, mobile religion device. Okay. So, and this idea that he has a sense of almost like a mission to the diaspora Jewish communities. How are they going to keep Torah in the diaspora? And again, in a very genteel way, this is assimilation and resistance. It's assimilation because he's translating his grandfather's document from Hebrew into Greek. It's resistance because it's about keeping alive the distinctive traditions of the Jewish people, even in a Greek culture. Okay, so assimilation and resistance. Better rename this session for next year as assimilation and resistance. Okay. So before we go into the literature, any observations, reflections on the significance of Ben Sira and that prologue from Ben Sira? So push any buttons for you. Nope, okay. Let me show you one other thing which is useful for a variety of research tools. I'm just going to do it this way for now. If we go earlyjewishwritings.com, I didn't think I'd been there that recently. There you go. Okay. So, so it's not going to put the URL at the top up for you, but there are two websites, both run by the same guy, a guy called Peter Kirby. Peter Kirby is a postgrad student on steroids. Okay, he's not a scholar working somewhere with 3 PhDs. He's doing this and its parallel site, earlychristianwritings.com, as just a kind of a private project that he's been running actually for several years now. Okay, so as you go through, okay, there are the main, over here as well, in the Tanakh material. Okay, so for instance, if you click on Daniel, and this is the same pattern that's used for all his work, including the early Christian texts, you get access to online texts for Daniel, you get online resources for Daniel, you get offline resources for Daniel, which they're called books. Okay. Like an information, like a learning manager, as a new name for a classroom teacher. And then we get, in each case, you'll get a couple of paragraphs where he just summarizes the kind of scholarly conversations around the particular document. So it's a brilliant go-to site if you just want to grab some information. Okay. So on the top you've got the Tanakh, and then you've got the Deuterocanon or Deuterocanonical books, and one of those is of course the Wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach. Okay. And same thing, information about the book, when it was translated, and online texts and so on of the thing. And similarly for all the other books we're going to be even mentioning in the next hour. Okay, so the Deuterocanonical books, the pseudepigrapha books, okay, 2nd Barak, 3rd Barak, 4th Barak, Apocalypse of Elijah, you name it. Dead Sea Scrolls coming soon. That's been there a while. The writings by Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish scholar living in the diaspora at Alexandria in Egypt. As you can see, quite a active writer, and of course there's more over here. Okay, Flavius Josephus, his writing comes out of the Jewish War. He was the offsider, and then eventually he'll have stuff on the Talmud as well. Okay, so a really, really useful site. Early Christian writings, a similar kind of thing. One of the things I particularly like about this site is everything is listed in date order. Okay, so if you want just to get a rough glint, so whereabouts do people say that the Gospel of Judas is from? Well, scholars normally put it somewhere between 130 and 170 in terms of when it was composed. So it's just a really quick way of getting into early Christian literature, parallel the early Jewish writings, okay? And exactly the same system. So a quick way to get into something like the Odes of Solomon or the prologue to Wisdom, prologue to Ben Sirach or whatever, go to earlyjewishwritings.com, scroll down to the one you want, click, away you go. Okay? Isn't it easy being a student these days? It's everything at your fingertips. Because you've got to read it all and process it all and everything. earlyjewishwritings.com, it's in the top but you won't see it, but it's literally all one word, earlyjewishwritings.com or earlychristianwritings.com. And they're just a fantastic resource. Okay. Oops. So, come back here. So that's a good way of getting into more details on any of the books that or the documents I'm going to refer to in the next 30 or 40 minutes. Okay. So what have we got? This screen and the next screen just kind of do a brief overview of the kind of genre. So amongst the complex set of writings generated by Jewish people during the Second Temple period, and leaving aside the core biblical text, we have the following kinds of things. We have stories of biblical and early post-biblical times, and I'll come back to some examples of these, continuing to write the same kind of stuff. We get stories where the Bible is rewritten and expanded. We get history, historiography, it's just a fancy way of saying history, historical literature. We get the writings of Josephus, who represents a distinct corpus of writings in his own right. We have the works of Philo of Alexandria, who was a kind of leading Jewish intellectual in Alexandria around the same time as Jesus. Okay, and he writes a letter to Gaius or Caligula on behalf of the Jewish community, appealing for the Jewish community not to be persecuted in Egypt. So he's a public intellectual. We have the wisdom literature, which we were talking a little bit about earlier. We have what are called testaments, because we know Testament as Old Testament, New Testament, and indeed Last Will and Testament, and that's the sense of the word. So the testamentary literature are when you construct a document which purports to be the last words of our dear ancestor X. Insert Moses, Elijah, Abraham, whoever you're inventing this literature for. Okay? And of course the interesting thing is there's absolutely no doubt that all of this literature is entirely spurious or pseudepigraphal. Nobody mistakes the Testament of Abraham or the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs or the Testament of Moses as in any sense having any authentic connection with Abraham, Moses, Jacob, whoever. Okay? But when it comes to the texts which have become canonical, some Christians want to say, but they must be real. They must be authentic. There can be no pseudepigraphy in the canonical texts. And yet the very same people that are writing the biblical texts are also writing and reading these texts. Okay, so it's in their literary comfort zone to create this kind of literature, some of which ended up being canonical, much of it ended up not being canonical. And of course what I'm suggesting is we should apply the same rules of evidence to the canonical literature as to the non-canonical literature when it comes to processes of literary formation, transmission, reflecting culture and all that sort of stuff. So the testaments reflect the idea that the last words of a dying man have great power. Okay? And so if on his deathbed Moses calls upon the future people to be faithful in the face of persecution, even if it means martyrdom, then that's a really powerful call for us to be brave and to resist. Okay. Continuing that list, you get the Sibylline Oracles. Now this is very clever stuff. The Sibylline Oracles, of course, are Roman imperial propaganda. Okay. This is from the Sibyls in Rome, and there was literature where the oracles and so on of the Sibyls was designed to glorify and validate and mandate the Roman Empire. So the Jews published their own Sibylline Oracles, which talk about the victory of the Jewish nation over that heathen empire from the west. Okay, so the Sibylline Oracles, as we now have them, include documents which were actually from the Sibyls, or from the Sibylline author, whatever, in Rome, as well as Christian-generated Sibylline Oracles and Jewish, because everybody played this game. It's like publishing Hitler's diary, it's that kind of thing. So there would you could be given people would say, oh, but the Sibylline Oracles, oh, gee, that's really impressive, that's like Nostradamus. But they may be faked up by the spin doctors back in Jerusalem or wherever to promote a Jewish agenda within the Roman world, or a Christian agenda within the Roman world. Okay, so these are sophisticated, worldly wise operatives. Again, this goes back to the question of wisdom literature, apocalyptic literature, and so on. The people writing and buying this stuff are pretty switched on. Okay, these are not the Taliban. These are people in Main Street. Okay, they sent their kids to Anglican schools. That's how mainstream they were. Then we get the apocalyptic literature, which we talked a little bit about before lunch, and that's the literature which is more about perseverance in the face of persecution and marginalisation, even to the point of martyrdom, because ultimately our struggle here is part of a bigger struggle going on upstairs. The victory will be won upstairs, but we have to play our part downstairs. Okay? And one of the big ideas in apocalyptic is the two worlds, this world and the world to come. Okay? And of course all the good stuff is in the world to come.
In terms of sheer numbers, it wouldn't have been, you talk about the authors and their contested views and representing different powers that be. Like in terms of sheer numbers though, you would have been in the hundreds, wouldn't they? Maybe the thousands of just people who were writing and communicating on that level in society.
You mean Jewish people, or you mean Roman literati?
Yeah, like both.
Okay. Well, actually, I don't know the answer to either form of the question. I was just trying to fudge it. Yeah. No, you're right.
Where, like we're swapped in, every man his dog has an opinion on a blog somewhere, and there's just millions of...
Actually, my dog doesn't yet, but I could do that. I could have a blog page for Belle, and she could voice my more radical opinions in a way that wouldn't come back to bite me. Yeah. And nobody would guess that it wasn't really Belle writing these opinions. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, no, point taken. So yes, we are. When you do the demographics, okay, and this again going back to Gerhard Lenski and so on, something like 65% of the population in an agrarian, and these don't just apply to the Roman world; they apply in agrarian empires like some medieval Europe, Japan before the Meiji Renaissance, and so on. When you have large agrarian base where the wealth is generated by agriculture, not primarily by conquest, sending armadas to South America and so on. That's a different kind of empire. But in agrarian empires, you have stable structures. Okay, roughly 65% of the population are peasants, and they're basically living on traditional holdings. And they're always on the edge of falling into debt because of bad harvest, bad crops, bad weather, whatever, bad seasons. The retainer class is something like 15%, and that includes the military leadership, it includes the scribes. I don't think it includes the temple. That's another like 2 or 3 or 5%. The ruling class itself is only like 1% or so. Then there's the merchant class, which is something like 3 to 5%. So we're getting pretty close to 100%. But at the bottom of the pile, there's another 10%, which are the expendables. And between the expendables and the peasants, there's the landless, the people that have lost their holdings and they're now having to get day jobs or whatever. Now, the mortality rates, of course, the further you go down the pecking order, the mortality rates become awful. At best, The people that are able to consume literature are going to be in the top 20% of the population, and not all of them are going to be generating it. So it's going to be a relatively small group of people. And indeed, the corpus of ancient Greek and Latin texts is not that large. Okay?
I guess what I was getting at is, would those texts have actually been competing in that sense? Because in terms of how they related to each other with those different worldviews.
You mean like the Jewish text versus the pagan texts? Or the
Yeah, like would those authors have been contesting their ideas? I guess, do you know what I mean? Like, or are they generating and transmitting that to a fairly defined?
No, I'm getting the question. I'm not sure how.
In modern,
Yeah.
modern days
Yeah.
now, there's a lot of debate and a lot of
Yeah. Okay.
contested space, whereas you start to get the sense actually the transmission would have been fairly hierarchical rather than.
Yeah, I think you're right. Now again, if we broaden the database out to include the New Testament documents and even the patristic documents, we get perhaps more data to work with. And what's going on there, and this would also be true in some ways for Josephus, certainly Philo, and I think for some of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually, there is a sense in which they are in debate, dialogue, discourse with rival opinions. There's also a sense in which they're talking inside their own circle. So Josephus writes his books partly to rehabilitate his own reputation as a traitor who swapped sides partway through the war and helped the Romans capture Jerusalem. And he's certainly in dialogue with his critics. Okay. He also gives us a clue actually about how books were published, because he describes sending copies of his manuscript to his friend Agrippa II, who'd been through the same experience, and getting him to kind of check his facts. He's really claiming that, Agrippa agrees with me, is what he's doing, but he's indicating how the leading circles would collaborate with each other to get a particular version of events out. And then he talks about how you would get a copy of my book. And basically I'm depositing a copy with this particular bookshop down in this quarter of Rome, and if you go and see that guy, he will give you a copy, and it'll be a certified copy that's being dinky dye. So it actually gets us into the book publishing segment as well. Go forward a little bit further to the time of Augustine and Jerome, so we're talking late 300s, okay? But the dynamics and the technology haven't changed that much. There we do get a public debate between two figures, but it's a fascinating story. Jerome gets I can't remember quite the details of which one goes where, but basically there's a difference of opinion about a matter of biblical interpretation, and so Augustine writes a critical piece. It doesn't go in the Sunday City Morning Herald. It gets sent to Jerome, hand delivered. But of course, hand delivered post meant you go down to the harbour, you find a ship that's leaving more or less in that direction, you give it to the captain or someone else, and when they get to the next port, they find somebody who's going more or less in that connection, and so on. Well, by the time, well before the letter got to Jerome, he'd heard of the contents. So he's written a response even before he's actually received the document from Augustine. So there's this public spat going on between two Christian leaders out in the public because the communication process was so slow. So that's an internal argument, but by then the church community is the Roman Empire, so that's a different kind of dynamic. And certainly Philo is more of a public intellectual, engaged in a project of kind of assimilating. He's more an assimilationist, and he's wanting to actually argue that Plato learned from Moses. That's why there's a lot of good stuff here, because it's already in the Torah, because Plato read Moses. So he's trying to pull the two traditions together, as he needed to do as a Greek intellectual who was also Jewish. He had to integrate, had to assimilate in some way. On the other hand, the Dead Sea Scrolls are much more internal Jewish and indeed specialist priestly leadership debates. But there's also a letter written by the teacher of righteousness, nice title, to the high priest, explaining the grounds of their difference. And if you just fix up this and this and this, we could come back. So there are public engagements that way as well. Okay, do it our way, we'll come back. Okay, so yeah, so these are presumably going to be literature circulating within limited communities. Although then that raises the question: so where do the Gospels fit in? Where does Acts fit in? I mean, where do the Pauline letters fit in? So letters, documents that might emerge as being local, get copied and circulated and become community property. And that's part of what's going on. And we get a glimpse of it in the prologue to Ben Sira, because he's actually saying, I realised when I got here that the kind of stuff my grandfather had been doing a couple of generations ago is what these people here need to know about. So I devoted every spare moment to getting the book translated. Okay. And that again gives us a clue as to how something might go from the arena of a school, a small group of disciples, and then take on a life of its own. And actually we found, not sure if it's actually ecclesiastic as it might be, one of the texts like Wisdom of Sirach, it had been assumed it was originally composed in Greek, and even though despite the prologue, but then we have actually found a copy of the Hebrew text in the Dead Sea among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we've actually got, as it were, the original as well as, or the original language as well as the text in translation. Yeah. So they're the main, because the other forms of documents that are very important are the kind of incidental caches which have occurred at places like Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, and that's like a town dump where masses of documents are there, and they include religious documents, but they include receipts from the shopping and letters from sons that are serving on the front line, and marriage contracts, and that gives us a massive amount of insight into everyday life. But these are not literature in the high sense of the word. You've got so apocalyptic literature, you get Gnostic literature, and one of the lines of thinking within Gnostic literature are texts that pay more attention to Jewish themes and Jewish ideas, and there's a whole world of scholarship around the history of Gnostic religion and where it parallels early Christianity and where it succeeds early Christianity. There's a sectarian text from Qumran, in other words, not the biblical manuscripts but their own in-house documents. And then there are psalms and hymns and prayers, again some of them turning up in other texts and some of them turning up at Qumran. And then there are letters. One of the features of life in the Hellenistic and Roman world was that literate people sent letters, and even open letters, intended to be read by the public rather than just private letters. So the letter became an important genre for communication and self-expression. And people kept journals and what I had for breakfast this morning, all that sort of stuff. Mercifully, they didn't have Facebook, so we didn't all have to see it. Okay, so examples of stories that come from biblical and early post-biblical times are things like the stories we find in Daniel chapter 1 to 6, so-called prayer of Nabonidus, a Babylonian king who converts in the tradition, the story of Susanna, and the story of Bel and the dragon, and these are two of the extra chapters added to the book of Daniel. The book of Tobit, which is a wonderful, wonderful story. Starts out with a guy who's had a bath and laid down before dinner, and a bird craps in his eye and he goes blind. And then the book goes from there. So guess what? End of the story, he gets his eyesight back. But it's a wonderful romance, a wonderful story in the meantime. Okay? Remember the first time I heard that read in chapel here, my eyes nearly popped out of my head. And, that's in the Bible? Wow. The martyrdom of Isaiah, which is not in the book of Isaiah, but it was in Jewish tradition. The lives of the prophets, the testament of Abraham, and the story of Joseph and Asenath. Asenath is Joseph's Egyptian wife, according to this tradition. After he's been restored to favour, and we're told he's given a wife. Well, who was she? What was she like? So we make up a story. The remainders, the Paralipomena, the remainders or the extra bits of Jeremiah, the Epistle of Aristeas, I would normally spell that with an A, so maybe that's just a typo on my part, and what we call Third Maccabees. So these are examples of text from the Second Temple period which would come under the category of stories which are basically the same as stories in the Bible. And they're either dated in the biblical period or they're set in the immediate post-biblical period. Then we get stories which actually take a part of the Bible and elaborate it and make it more interesting. Okay? So we get the first Enoch, we get the Book of Giants, and so on. So amongst the Enoch traditions, we get the idea that, well, okay, Genesis 6 said that the sons of God came down to earth and they slept with the daughters of men and they created giants. Now there's a story just waiting to be told, because Genesis doesn't tell us the rest of the story. So we get the Book of the Giants, which is part of the Enoch literature. Okay? So if you ever can't sleep, there's always more bits of the Bible to read than you imagined.
That was in Noah, wasn't it? It's in the story of Noah.
Yeah, Genesis 6, just the paragraph. It's in Genesis, it's one of the bits of evidence of how bad things have got. Even the angels are not stopping upstairs. They're coming downstairs and messing with the girls. And they're having monsters as a result. Is that in the movie Noah? Probably. I mean, I will get to see it. I just have been...
Monsters are
fallen angels. Yeah. Well, I'm going to say monster. They're called giants in the... No, how do we get these giants that are part of the mythical tradition of the Old Testament? You know, the giants in Palestine at the time of Joshua and so on. Well, it's because they're the offshoot of improper sexual liaisons between heavenly creatures and earthly creatures. Whereas in the Greek world, the same thing happens, but they're called heroes, not giants. Okay. You get the Book of Jubilees, which takes up the idea of the year of Jubilees, and it's an expansion, elaboration of the Bible. The Genesis Apocryphon, the Book of Biblical Antiquities, the books of Adam and Eve, the Apocalypse of Moses, Philo the epic poet, Theodosius the epic poet, Ezekiel the tragedian, Darius's bodyguards, sounds like a good night out in Babylon, the additions to Esther, the compositions of David from Cave 11 at Qumran, First Baruch, the Epistle of Jeremiah, and the Prayer of Azariah and the Three Jews. Okay, so these are things which take a detail, a paragraph, or even just a hint out of a Bible text, and they grow a whole story out of it. Like my grandma used to take a shoot whenever we visit anybody's house. She'd take some cuttings from their garden, take them home, and next thing we'd have all these things growing because she had a green thumb, so to speak. Then there are historical works, which include First Esdras, which is not Ezra, but First Esdras, and there are various Hellenistic historians which are probably Jewish fake documents, so the fragments of Demetrius and Eupolemus and so on, and more significantly First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. Okay, and in terms of New Testament material, of course, things like Mark and Matthew and Luke, Acts might come into this category as well. Oops, wrong button. Then, of course, you get Josephus, who in one sense, well, Josephus writes historical material, but really Josephus writes about Josephus. I mean, he's a topic on his own, okay? So, yes, he writes the Jewish war after the event, and that's really where he's justifying and explaining the course of the war. He was, after all, the commander of Jewish forces in the Galilee, and he defected to Vespasian when he was arrested. Then he has the Antiquities of the Jewish People, which is about celebrating the classical antiquity of Jews, that they were not just a Johnny-come-latelys on the world scene. And then he was having a particular sustained argument with a guy called Appion, and so this is very much a public, you said this, I'm saying that kind of debate. But Josephus is a very important set of writings, never became sacred texts, okay, but very important as helping us to understand the historical and political dynamics of the time. Then there's Philo, as you can see, quite a body of works. A number of his writings are on the exposition of the law of Moses. In other words, Torah. He's a Torah scholar, and he does a whole lot of exegesis on Torah, where he basically applies Platonic exegesis to the Torah. As I said, he's about assimilation. Similarly, he offers a number of allegorical interpretations of various parts of the biblical tradition, including Jonah and Samson, and then he has documents which are written around particular philosophical questions on the contemplative life. Every good man is free, on the eternity of the world, and whether animals have reason. Okay? And ultimately, he wrote the Embassy to Gaius, or Caligula, where he participated in that approach to the emperor to get an easing of the persecutions which were beginning to affect Jewish people in Alexandria. So again, a well-connected character. There's the wisdom literature, which is post-biblical, that comes out of this period. So the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, that's Ben Sira. The wisdom of Solomon, which could be one of the last of these documents to have been written, and some people date it to 40 AD, 40 CE, in which case it's after Easter and when Paul is only just beginning to get going. Okay? And then the sentences of Sibylline and of course 4th Maccabees. These are all examples of wisdom literature, but Sirach and the wisdom of Solomon are the two most significant. The Testament literature I mentioned earlier. So you have one document called the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, and you can see straight away how their mind is working. If one testament is good, what about we get the final words of all 12 of the patriarchs? I mean, that will be a lay down misere. Okay? They'll have to listen to us then. Okay? So literally you go through each of the 12 patriarchs in turn and you get their dying words, and guess what? They're all predicting events somewhere in the Hellenistic period and what it's going to mean, what it's going to require of people to live faithfully at that point in time. Okay? The Testament of Moses, a similar kind of exercise, and the Testament of Job. So taking these great characters and continuing the imaginative exercise. So at the end of his life, when it did come time for Job to die, what do we imagine he would have said? What would have been the big lesson that Job had to pass on? So we'll publish it. We'll get it out there. And I mentioned the Sibylline Oracles, and so these are the parts of the Sibylline Oracles which have sort of Jewish contributions. Okay, I think that's a really clever strategy on behalf of the Jewish people. Let's take the dominant discourse, let's take one of the favourite genre of the empire, and let's just fake it up. Let's just write some stuff that works in our favour and get it out there with all the rest of the propaganda. So I like their attitude. Apocalyptic literature, which we've touched on already in some more detail, but these are the major sort of explicitly and kind of characteristically apocalyptic texts. There are also apocalyptic passages in Isaiah and in Zechariah and so on, but these are the documents which are kind of primarily apocalyptic literature in character. So the second half of the book of Daniel, which is the visions and the prayers of Daniel, whereas chapters 1 to 6 is stories. First Enoch, Second Enoch, which is the version of, which is a text from the Slavonic tradition. Second Baruch, which is a Syriac document. Third Baruch, which is a Greek text, also claiming to be by Baruch. Baruch, of course, is Jeremiah's assistant. Okay, and first Baruch is in the Apocrypha, but that didn't stop people generating even more Baruch literature. So in the Slavonic part of the world, the Syriac-speaking Christian communities, the Greek-speaking Christian communities, you get these other texts coming out. Fourth Ezra, which these days is normally seen as being part of Second Esdras, and the Apocalypse of Abraham. Again, the idea there being that surely with everything else that God had told Abraham, he would have also mentioned what was going to happen at the end of the world. I mean, he didn't really have any secrets from Abraham. So we must have a copy of that somewhere. And if we're not, I've got a PhD student who can create it for you. Okay? And of course, again, the little note in square brackets, don't forget the book of Revelation. It's also, in fact, it's the archetypal, definitive apocalypse, hence the name, the Apocalypse of John. It comes from Christian sources, but the Christian writer is very influenced by Jewish themes and content. Oh, okay. Formatting thing went a bit funny there. Then we get, as I said, Jewish sources in the later Gnostic literature. So you get the so-called Testimony of Truth, you get the Melchizedek traditions, the Apocrypha of John, Hypostasis of the Archons, the Apocalypse of Adams and Poimandres. And so in the case, say, of the figure of Melchizedek, who occurs in Hebrews, in the New Testament tradition, but also occurs in Genesis chapter 14 and in one of the Psalms. Okay, I think it might be Psalm 110. There was always something of a puzzle as to what this Melchizedek character was on about, but at the Dead Sea Scrolls we've found 3 or 4 documents dealing with the traditions about Melchizedek. Okay, and Melchizedek is basically a rewriting of Michael the Archangel. The word means king of righteousness, and guess what his opposite number at Qumran is called? Melchi-Resha. Melchi-Resha means Darth Vader in Hebrew. No, it means king of yuckiness, king of badness. Okay, so Melchizedek is part of an explicitly dualistic expression of Jewish religion, where instead of having God up against Satan, you have Melchizedek up against Melchi-Resha, the king of light or the king of righteousness against the king of darkness. Melchizedek wears white, of course, and Melchi-Resha would be in black, I'm sure. So suddenly we can understand why the person who writes the letter to the Hebrews talks about Jesus being like Melchizedek. Okay? Because he's in that kind of role. He's the leader of the good guys in the struggle of good with evil. So that's what Hebrews is doing. We had no way of making sense of that because the Melchizedek traditions had been lost, and we've now recovered some of them from Dead Sea. And of course, I'm not wanting to suggest that John's Gospel is Gnostic, but it's certainly true that the Gnostics really liked John's Gospel. Okay, and there are certainly elements in John's Gospel with the way it portrays Jesus, where he's this heavenly figure who's come down to earth. He's come to reveal the truth, so that you will know the truth, and by knowing the truth, which is Gnosticism, you will see the light. And there's a very Gnostic kind of undertone to the Gospel of John, so playing into that kind of theological audience. And then we have the incredible amount of material which has come out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the 1950s in particular. We have documents which are providing the rules for the community. We have biblical interpretation, the so-called Pesher books. Pesher being the word that means. So you quote a verse. It's like doing a verse-by-verse commentary for your exegesis. Quote the verse or the phrase, then you say Pesher, and you say what it really means. And of course the meaning of that ancient text is something to do with the life situation of the person writing the commentary. Now the Pesher become interesting for 2 reasons. One, they give us early evidence for the content of the text. Secondly, they show us how the text was being used in one particular Jewish community, albeit a group of grumpy old priests who didn't get on with the new prayer book or whatever in the temple because they changed the calendar. Okay, but it shows us that people were communities, literate, highly intentional, religious, observant communities, were writing commentaries, written reflections and interpretations of the Psalms, Habakkuk, so on, Nahum and other texts. Then they have a number of eschatological compositions, some of which could almost be apocalyptic, but it's not just apocalyptic. And Melchizedek gets a run there as well. They have poetic and liturgical works, which includes the Thanksgiving scroll, Thanksgiving hymns. There's halakha, which is the Jewish word or the Hebrew word for instruction in how you're to live. Okay, so Haggadah is when you tell somebody a story. Halakha is when you say, no, this is what you've got to do. Because halach is the word for walk. So halakha is how you're going to walk. Okay, how you're going to behave, how you're going to act. And there are other things, like the copper scroll that says where the hidden treasure from the temple is buried, and all those fascinating things to get Indiana Jones excited. Okay, and in addition to all that, there are about 200 biblical manuscripts at Qumran. Okay, so just an amazing accidental discovery. And needless to say, they went into every cave down both sides of the Dead Sea for the next 15 years, checking that there's nothing else in any of them caves. Okay. All right, almost there for this stuff. Then you get other, more, if you like, personal, devotional kind of literature being written, psalms, hymns, and prayers. And there's a whole list of them there. Some of the most interesting ones, of course, are the ones that are added, that are created at Qumran, and some of the variation in the Psalter at Qumran and the hymn scroll from Qumran, but also things like the Odes of Solomon and the Psalms of Solomon, and some of the other prayers that occur within the context of other texts. Okay, so a character will be described as doing something, and then the character moves into a prayer. So you get these Jewish prayers surviving, embedded in other texts. Now, we get similar things in the New Testament, specifically in the Gospel of Luke, the Magnificat and the Benedictus and the Nunc Dimittis. Okay, they're poetic hymn fragments placed on the lips of key characters in the story of Luke 1 and Luke 2 by the author. Okay. Letters, as I mentioned, as you can see, we've got lots and lots of letters. And we also have letters which have survived from the Bar Kokhba period, actually letters between the leader Bar Kokhba and some of his people. Okay, so we have letters that exist within other documents. So within the first book of Maccabees, there are 11 letters that are used as part of the story. Okay, second Maccabees, third Maccabees, and so on. Josephus quotes 37 different letters when he's telling his story. And I got this letter from so-and-so, and he said blah, 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 blah. Okay. The Epistle of Aristeas, this time spelled correctly, is one we'll come back to in a moment. The decrees that we get in the book of Daniel and so on. These are all examples of letters, epistles, or official promulgations, communications. We look at the New Testament, because there are 14 letters attributed to Paul, if you count Hebrews. There are 7 letters in the rest of the New Testament, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, letter of James, etc. There are 2 letters embedded in the book of Acts, and there are the 7 letters embedded in chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Revelation. So letters were kind of flavour of the month for Jewish and Christian people, 100 years either side of the turn of the era. And when you look at rabbinic texts, you happen to see the same thing continuing on there as well. Okay, so there's this massive amount of literature going out there, and one of the things that points us to, of course, is the significance of the Septuagint, or the Greek version of the Old Testament, or indeed the Greek version of the Bible. But in that point of time, it was just the Old Testament. And of course, Septuagint just means done by the 70, the work of the 70, the 70 scholars, the 70 scribes. Okay. We don't actually have existing copy of the Septuagint from its first issue. When people talk about the Septuagint these days, they're talking about the Codex Sinaiticus from St. Catherine's Monastery, which is early to mid 4th century CE. It's a copy of the Greek Bible, including the Old Testament with the Apocrypha, and the New Testament, plus a couple of other New Testament Apocrypha, which are no longer in the Christian Bible, but they were at the time in the Bible. Okay, and Codex Sinaiticus is not only, if you like, our oldest complete example of the Septuagint, it's also the oldest and it's the only physical book to have survived from the Roman Empire. Okay, so it's an amazing cultural treasure, and it's a Bible with the Old and New Testament. The larger Old Testament with the Apocrypha, and the New Testament plus, I think it's the Shepherd of Hermes and the Epistle of Barnabas are also included in the Bible at that point. Okay, so it's an amazing cultural and spiritual event. It seems to have been produced at some time during the 3rd century BCE, so that's in the 200s. In other words, prior to the Battle of Panias, when Egyptian influence was dominant in Palestine. And the story is set, of course, in Egypt, and it's a project sponsored by the Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, who wants to foster the spiritual well-being of his Jewish taxpayers. Okay, and if you believe that, I've got a bridge out back that you might want to buy as well. But that's the way they're telling the story. Okay, so it's a story about assimilation. It's a story about getting royal patronage for the Jewish Bible, okay, which is a pretty amazing cultural, spiritual development. And it reflects a positive attitude towards the Egyptian rulers, the Ptolemies, which was not going to be the case once the Seleucids took over. I mean, indeed, and this could actually be a reason for arguing against what I'm saying, but that's just because I'm always skeptical, even of myself. Given what happens once the Seleucids take over, where the Torah is actually being destroyed. It was illegal to own a copy of the Torah. It was illegal to circumcise your sons. It was illegal to keep Shabbat. Okay? So there's a deliberate attempt to exterminate and to force assimilation of Jewish and to exterminate distinctive Jewish cultures. Assimilation, resistance. You'll get that by the end of the day. So we just cannot imagine anybody telling the story of the Septuagint with the book being sponsored by the Seleucid ruler. I mean, that's not going to happen. Okay? There's no way that a Seleucid ruler is ever going to promote, because they're on the track record as trying to destroy every last copy of the Torah, trying to stamp out Jewish identity, trying to destroy Jewish religion. Now, my questioning, skeptical, don't believe anything till you take it home kind of mind says, okay, so was the Septuagint actually a project of these generous, benevolent, kindly, well-informed Ptolemaic rulers in the 50 years before Antiochus came on the scene? Or is that actually a bit of a spin to project back into the pre-Seleucid period, a wonderful time when we were governed by the Egyptians, and they not only allowed us to be free, they even paid for our Bible to be translated into Greek. Okay? So is it too good to be true, is what's going on there in my brain. Okay? But the traditional version is that the Septuagint is a deliberate development, and there are a couple of different legends which we'll look at in just a moment, which comes out of the sort of Ptolemaic period of Egyptian rule. In any case, whether it was in the 3rd century or the 2nd century, it can't be much later than about 150, if that, and it represents an amazing literary and theological achievement from this period. So let's look just very briefly. This again is where these websites come into play from much earlier in the year, in the semester. So here are the relevant bits. Now, of course, I'm going to have to scan this backwards and forward, but this is the version of the story as told in the letter of Aristeas. Okay? 3 days later, Demetrius took the men, and passing along the sea wall 7 stadia long to the island, crossed the bridge and made for the northern districts of Pharos. There he assembled them in a house which had been built upon the seashore of great beauty in a secluded location. This is a great place for a research seminar. Okay, and invited them to carry out the work of translation, since everything they needed for the purpose was placed at their disposal. Okay, So they set to work comparing their several results and making them agree. So this is one version of the story. And whatever they agreed upon was suitably copied out under direction of Demetrius. Okay? The session lasted until the 9th hour. After this, they were set free to minister to their physical needs. Bring out the wine, bring out the dancing girls. Everything they wanted was furnished for them on a lavish scale. In addition to this, Dorotheus made the same preparations for them daily as were made for the king himself. They were on a really good package while they worked on this project, okay? For thus he had been instructed, commanded by the king. In the early morning they appeared daily at the court of the king, and after saluting the king, went back to their own place. And as is the custom of all the Jews, they washed their hands in the sea, prayed to God, and then devoted themselves to reading and translating the particular passage upon which they were engaged. And I put the question to them, why is it that they washed their hands before they prayed? And they explained it was a token that they had done no evil, for every form of activity is wrought by means of hands, since in their noble and holy way they regard everything as a symbol of righteousness and truth. As I've already said, they met together daily in the place which was delightful for its quiet and its brilliance, applied themselves to their task, and it so chanced that the work of translation was completed, drumroll, in 72 days. Just as if this had been arranged of set purpose. When the work was completed, Demetrius collected together the Jewish population in the place where the translation had been made, read it over to all in the presence of the translators, who met with a great reception also from the people because of the great benefits which they had conferred upon them. So you'd really be lucky if you had a copy of this book. You'd be really privileged. This story has echoes of Ezra reading out the Pentateuch in Nehemiah chapter 9. Okay? In Philo's description of it, he has a slightly different version. Therefore, being settled in a secret place, and nothing even being present with them except the elements of nature, the earth, the water, the air, and the heaven, so it's a very pure philosophical environment. No royal pension, no dancing girls, no wine, no getting the leftovers or indeed the first count of the king's diet. Okay, so they began with the creation of what they're going in the first place to explain. For the account of creation of the world is the beginning of the law. They, like men inspired, prophesied, not one saying one thing and another, but every one of them employed the self-same nouns and verbs as they make their translation. Okay? So this would be like me getting a translation exercise in the Greek class, and everybody has come with an absolutely identical translation. And when I said, have you been copying? They say, no, God told me to write it this way. And I'd say, you're going to have a hard job selling that to the academic misconduct officer in the Faculty of Arts. But it worked in the case of okay? It was as if some unseen prompter had suggested all their language to them. So this is where you actually get, for the first time in kind of biblical language and discourse, the idea that the Holy Spirit or God's Spirit is kind of almost telling them what to write. Okay? It comes from Philo, it doesn't come from the Bible originally. And yet who is there who does not know that every language, and the Greek language above all others, is rich in a variety of words, and that it is possible to vary a sentence and to paraphrase the same idea so as to set it forth in a great variety of manners, adopting many different forms of expression to it at different times. But this, they say, did not happen at all in the case of this translation of the law, but that in every case exactly corresponding Greek words were employed to translate literally the appropriate Chaldaic words. That's an interesting blooper. Being adapted with exceeding propriety to the matters which were to be explained. So it shows Philo doesn't understand that the Old Testament is not written in Chaldean, it's written in Hebrew. So actually, how good was his Hebrew if he thinks it's Chaldean? Okay? So why he's used Chaldean or Chaldaic there, but you get the idea of what's going on. You need to go, that's okay, just move away when you need to. It's not. Okay, I've got to get out of this beast. Here we go. All right, so the letter of Aristeas, the letter of Philo's explanation in the life of Pilate, and then we get a similar kind of account in 2nd Ezra 14. And so what point I'm getting at there is that as part of the reception history of these books, and as part of the reception of this fairly controversial religious innovation called a Greek Bible, okay, one of the ways in which you validate this innovation is to demonstrate this could only have happened as a miracle. There is no possibility of this being a human event. God has been at work here. Now what you're saying, of course, is that, the Greek version of the Bible is every bit as inspired and authoritative as the Hebrew version. I mean, that's the political game that they're playing with these legends and so on. Okay? So that implies that the Hebrew form of the text is already held in considerable regard, and the challenge for the people who wanted to assimilate into a Greek-speaking world was to demonstrate that a Greek version of the Bible was every bit as kosher as a Hebrew version of the Bible. And not only that, it was paid for by the king. So really we should be good, happy taxpayers and happy little campers wherever we happen to be in the diaspora. Okay? So, just wrapping this up briefly. So the history of the biblical canon remains obscure and is of course contested in various ways. But there's a few broad points perhaps we can make. First is that the Septuagint, the LXX, preserves the form of the Jewish scriptures as they were known in some Jewish circles, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, prior to the time of Jesus. Okay? So this is a Jewish Bible. It just happens to be in Greek. Because everybody was writing graffiti in Greek, why not write the Bible in Greek as well? Okay? The Masoretic text, MT, is a version of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, and it reflects another Jewish form of the Tanakh, which are there spelt with a CH instead of a KH. It's just a different transliteration. And it's also attested at Qumran. But the earliest existing manuscripts of the Masoretic text are actually later than the oldest existing manuscripts of the Septuagint, namely Codex Sinaiticus and so on, by about 500 years or so. Okay? So yes, the Hebrew comes first, but as it happens, we have older copies of the Greek than we have copies of the Hebrew. So it's all part of the wonderful complexity of how we got the Bible and how we know we got the Bible. Okay, in the Greek-speaking churches of the Middle East, like in Greece and Palestine and so on, they still use the Septuagint. That's still their Bible. Okay, they can't really understand ancient Greek, but the priests do, and actually that's not much different from the Pentateuch being issued in Hebrew, which nobody could speak in the 3rd or 4th century. Okay, so the Bible functions in the Greek Orthodox Church as the Greek Bible. As my Greek hairdresser tells me, everything in the world was invented by the Greeks, including the Bible, and he actually suspects Jesus was probably Greek, really. Okay? So it's no surprise to him that the Bible they use in church at St George's at South Brisbane, West End, is the Bible they were using at St Catherine's Monastery in the 4th century. That's just how it is.
And do they not, ancient Greek is very different. They really don't understand.
Yeah, ancient Greek to them is like Chaucer's English to us. Yeah, it's like, well, that's too hard, just let the priest read it. That's what you pay them for. Part of the division of labour. I'll go and catch the fish, you say the prayers. So the Greeks are still using that version of the Bible. More importantly for us, culturally, because the Septuagint was the basis of the Latin Vulgate. And the Latin Vulgate was the Bible that dominated in the West, right through to the Reformation and indeed beyond. Okay, So the form of the Bible as we experienced it in Western Europe was very much shaped by the Septuagint channeled through the Latin Vulgate. The time of the Reformation, Protestant churches like, say, the Lutherans, Presbyterians and so on, they chose to drop out of their Bible the bits of the Old Testament which were not also found in the Hebrew version. But they kept the Septuagint arrangement. Okay, they didn't go back to Torah, Nevi'im and Ketuvim. They kept law, history, poetry, major prophets, minor prophets, but they just dropped out the 12 or 13 books which were only in the Septuagint and not in the Masoretic. So if you like, the familiar Protestant Old Testament is a kind of a hybrid form of the Old Testament that developed by chance at the Reformation, because it's like a half-completed substitution. Okay, they've sort of reverted to the Jewish Bible, but they haven't reverted to the Jewish arrangement of the Jewish Bible. So they haven't quite got the significance of Tanakh in the Old Testament. Anglicans, being Anglicans, try to have 2 shillings each way. So in the articles and so on, as we'll see a bit later on, the Apocrypha continues within the Anglican definition of the Old Testament. It was always included in the so-called authorized versions of the Bible, which were published within the United Kingdom. And interesting, the popular King James version that does not have the Apocrypha, that's a North American innovation. Okay, it's not part of the Anglican tradition to publish a King James or authorized version which does not include the Apocrypha. There's a wonderful story from the enthronement of Queen Victoria's successor, Edward VI, I think it was. The British and Foreign Bible Society had a special copy of the Bible bound and so on, sent to Lambeth Palace to be used for the coronation oath. And it was sent back because it didn't have the Apocrypha, and therefore could not be used in an Anglican church and could not be used for the sovereign's oath, because it was a mutilated Bible. Okay? So, again, is that significant theologically? No, it's just part of a cultural history of where you draw the boundaries, who's in, who's out, all that kind of stuff.